Billboard Example.
In this video, we're going to take a look at how the example of a billboard can explore the relationship between design goals, design barriers, and the elements and principles of visual design. This video is intended to complement 3.1, and if you have not watched that video yet, please make sure you watch that first. So the key focus here is to explore how design goals are impacted by barriers and constraints within the design process, and secondarily, how design principles and elements can be used to solve these problems when they come up. To explore this, I want to take a look at an example of a billboard, and for this context we'll look at billboards that are put up at the sides of road. Now these billboards have a specific context and they would have a specific purpose as well. The first thing that I want to keep in mind though is that the purpose of the billboard, or the goal of the billboard, would be to communicate information to a large number of people. Second, this information should be accessible to the targeted population. This includes accessible in terms of the language that is used, the images that are used, slogans that you might want to use, etc. Third, the board will attempt to capture people's attention or their interest. So we want to make sure that we're able to draw people in, to get them to have a response to the board, whether this be an emotional response, an intellectual response, or a commercial response. That really doesn't matter, but we want to make sure they're having an experience where they're having a response to the board. So once we consider the goals of the board, we then need to consider what the constraints are. Some of the constraints will be provided by the client. They may say, I have a really good color that I want to use, or a pre-existing logo. However, in addition to the constraints that are provided by the client, there are also going to be other constraints that are determined by the context of the board. So if we follow the PBL approach, these constraints are presented as questions, and you should give consideration to each of these questions as we move forward. The key thing to think about here is how can visual principles be used to respond to design problems that emerge from the constraints that are provided. And this question can really be applied to any design work that you engage in. One example of constraints is space. Now, space is not unlimited on a billboard, even though they are generally huge. We do have a very specific space requirement that we need to take a look at. In addition to the size of the board, we also have to take a look at the proximity of the viewer to the board. So we know that people generally don't look at large billboards really close up. So this is going to impact how we go about creating a visual experience for them, since we know they're going to be pretty far away from the board when they're looking at it. The other thing to keep in mind is that billboards that are put up on highways or malls, they're generally smaller, but billboards on roads are rectangular in nature, and they also are usually put in landscape mode, which means that they're wider than they are tall. The other barrier to take into consideration is time. So this deals with the problem of how do we communicate information to a large number of people over a short period of time. Now, I used some moving text there to give an example of how if you're trying to communicate a lot of information and you only have a very short period of time to do it, that can be quite a challenge that you have to think about. So for example, if we want to take a look at somebody who's looking at a billboard while they're driving, most likely they shouldn't have a lot of time to do so unless they're stuck in traffic. So you better make your billboard funny or thought-provoking. In this case, the barriers of space and time, as well as accessibility, they all come together to create new challenges that a visual approach can help to solve. So at this stage, what we need to do is redefine what our design goals are. So for example, we want to know how do we communicate information in a short period of time to a large number of people. Now, because we don't have a lot of time, this will be one of the constraints that we have to consider. So we want to emphasize specific information in a short period of time. Once we've identified what these goals are, and there could be others, we're going to think about how can we use principles and elements of design, visual design, to help answer these problems. So let's take a look at a very practical example that many of you are probably already familiar with. Let's just say you're a dairy company and you want to communicate to people the importance of drinking milk. Your company feels that it's healthy, it promotes bone density, it provides daily recommended doses of calcium and vitamin D and all that other good stuff. Now, one thing I want to really emphasize here is that I'm not saying these things because they're true, or I'm not saying that they are true, and this is one of the other conundrums of visual design work. Oftentimes, you may not agree with the content, but your goal or your job in this regard is to actually not think about whether or not the content is something that you agree with, but how can you create it in a way that matches the goals of the client. So this debate about milk and whether it does a body good, completely different debate altogether, so we're not going to get into that. The issue is, how do I communicate these things to a large number of people over a short period of time? And I'm going to be doing this on a billboard. Now let's bring this problem to life. I'm going to add some movement to this board so we can kind of get a sense of what this might look like to somebody who's driving. Now obviously it's not going to be exact replication because I'm not in a car and neither are you. But generally what we have is movement. So movement from left to right. Here we go. I'm giving it 6 seconds to move across the screen. Nice and slow. Now the image might be a little bit blurry for you because it's backlit. And this is another problem when we need to think about how mediums impact information that's being communicated. A medium that is experienced on a digital screen is generally backlit, which means if you have something that's moving across a backlit screen, it's going to come across blurry regardless of how you do it. So that's something to think about. But in this case, when a billboard is moving, the billboard's not actually moving, it's the person that's moving. So let's add some message to this, or sorry, some text that tries to emphasize our message. So the client might say to you, this is the text that I want to present to my potential viewers. So they're going to say milk products are important because they're one of the 4 major food groups. They contain vitamin D and calcium and all this other good stuff. So what we need to be able to do is we need to take all this information and to put it into a format that's accessible. So we can see right away when we apply all this information to a to a billboard, and we have that billboard move across the screen. Look at that. Yeah, we definitely have a problem. So the problem that we have here is this is a lot of text to read and we don't have a lot of time to read it. I'm not sure if anybody was able to actually read all that text, but I can definitely not get past the second sentence. Now if we play with the typography a bit, so we know that typography is one of the elements of design that we can adjust or play with in order to help us communicate a specific message. We're going to change the typography to a sans serif font. Because serif fonts actually require more visual processing. And now if you're interested in sans serif versus serif, you can Google that. There's a lot of information on it. But the idea here is that serif fonts are generally more visually complex, so they take longer a period of time to actually read. So we've changed the font to an Arial font, so it has no serifs on it. And again, we can't really read all of the text, but for most people's eyes, that's actually a little bit easier to read than the first slide. But still, we're not doing too good here. Now, let's just say we wanted to add the element of color. So color is one of those things that is you can generally use in very specific ways, and it can be very powerful for helping you to communicate a message. Now, I'm going to add some color to specific terms to emphasize those terms. Really important point here about color. You shouldn't pick color haphazardly. Any color that you pick in your design work should be purposeful. Don't just pick a random color because you think it looks cool. It should have some connection to your message. So if you ever put color in your design work, your client should ask you, why did you choose that color? So for the purpose of this, I'm going to choose a blue. And this isn't any old blue. This is sky blue. So sky blue is indicative of openness and lightness and a bright sunny day. All the things that we want to relate to the natural environment of cows in a pasture. Now, because my message is positive, sky blue helps to reinforce that. If you look more into the psychology of color, which I strongly recommend that you do, you'll find that each color has a very implicit message that it communicates to the viewer without the viewer actually knowing it. And sky blue is one of those colors that's light and positive and tries to connect a positive experience. So, with adding that element of color, let's run that to the board. So here we go. Here's our board, and we can see important, vitamin D, calcium, essential, developing, maintaining. So we didn't get to see everything, but there are a few words that jumped out there as we were going along. So that's a little bit better. But what you can see is by changing the typography and the color, I've made the content of my message a little bit more accessible. However, it's still difficult to read because there's too much text. So I could continue to play with other elements such as line and scale and proximity and all that kind of stuff. But really the challenge here is I have too much text, so I need to be a little bit more creative in how I approach this problem and go back to my design goals. As you recall, one of the primary design goals was that I want to capture people's attention. So do I really need to have all this text on this billboard? Or could I just do it in a different way to get people interested in the message? So as you probably know, this example has already been done in a real context, and the response to this problem was the Got Milk campaign. So what the organizations figured out was that they don't need to tell everyone everything about milk on a billboard. They can just put up a slogan, Got Milk, ? And that gets the viewer interested in thinking about the product. So let's just look at what this looks like when we're moving it. So we got this board moving across. We can clearly read got milk, and so that gets you to start to think a little bit. Do I got milk? No, I don't have milk. Should I have milk? Why should I have milk? So this gets the viewer starting to engage in the material itself, as opposed to it just being a big list of text. Now, we can also add elements of design to play with this a little bit more as well. So if we took the element of color, and we said, okay, let's take a black background and put white text on it, and then we'll flip it. This embraces the color palette that would be found in a dairy cow and uses the principles of contrast to help you communicate or emphasize that message. So let's play that back and see what that looks like on a moving board. So again, got milk. Both of those words really jump out. They pop, so to speak. And with just some adjustments of typography and contrast, the message becomes much more clear. Now, the message is fairly ambiguous, so the point here is to get people to go somewhere else for more information. So what if we take the exact same elements of contrast, we have got milk, but we add a web link, so we just put .ca at the end. Now people will know, again, context is important, people will know that there's a website where they can get more information about, why they should drink milk. Okay, so the key point here is we need to understand that the design problem of time and of space, these are two design problems that we articulated early on, they can be approached using specific design principles. So we can use color, we can use typography, and we can use contrast to emphasize or to solve for the problems of time and space. So as you move forward in your design work, I'm hoping that the Billboard example just emphasizes that you have to ask yourself a very key question when doing design work. You have to really think about how can the principles and elements of design help you in solving design problems. Now, the first thing you have to do is articulate your goals. Then you have to figure out what are the constraints and barriers and what problems do they create. And then thirdly, you think about, okay, how can I use these different elements of line, color, shape, texture, proximity to help answer some of those questions. So that's the Billboard example, and it gives you just a brief overview of how you can use the elements and principles of design, visual design, to help solve design problems.
Thanks for watching video 3.3, the Billboard example.